Branson Calloway leaned back in his chair, arms crossed as his best friend, Leo, grinned at him from across the penthouse suite. "You wouldn't last a month without your money," Leo said, swirling his glass of whiskey. Branson arched a brow. "You think I can't survive without a black card?" "I don't think I know," Leo shot back. "You're a millionaire, Branson. You've never had to worry about rent, bills, or where your next meal is coming from." "You wouldn't last a week, let alone a month." Branson exhaled, glancing out at the glittering city skyline. He had built his fortune from the ground up, but he had never actually lived without wealth. The challenge intrigued him. Leo smirked. 1 month, no money, no penthouse, no connections. "You start with $200 in cash and that's it. If you can make it the whole month, I'll donate $500,000 to the charity of your choice." Branson's jaw tightened. "And if I fail?" "You have to host my sister's wedding at your vineyard and personally cater the entire thing." Branson groaned. Leo's sister was a perfectionist, and her wedding would be a nightmare to plan. "Fine," Branson said, shaking Leo's hand. 1 month, no money, no help, I'll prove you wrong." 2 days later, Branson stood outside a rundown apartment complex in a neighborhood he had never set foot in before. His tailored suits and expensive watches were gone, replaced by a simple t-shirt and jeans he had bought at a thrift store. He had found a cheap room for rent above a tiny diner, a place barely big enough to turn around in, but it would do. His goal was simple: get a job, make just enough to get by, and prove Leo wrong. The diner downstairs was hiring, and Branson figured working there would be an easy way to make cash. The moment he stepped inside, the scent of coffee and sizzling bacon hit him. The place was small, with worn booths and a counter that had seen better days. A young woman in an apron was balancing a tray of plates, her dark hair pulled into a messy ponytail. She turned, and for a second Branson forgot how to breathe. She was beautiful. Not in the polished, designer-clad way of the women he usually met at galas, but in a way that felt real. Her deep brown eyes locked onto his, and she arched a brow. "Can I help you?" she asked, shifting the tray onto her hip. Branson cleared his throat. "I'm here about the job." She studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Follow me." She led him to the back, where a gruff older man was flipping pancakes on a grill. "Caleb, got another one," she said. Caleb turned, wiping his hands on a towel. "You ever worked in a diner before?" Branson hesitated. "Not exactly." The woman rolled her eyes. "Figures." "I learn fast," Branson insisted. Caleb huffed. "Fine, you start now. Aprons are in the back, don't screw up." Branson barely had time to grab an apron before the woman shoved a notepad into his hands. "You take orders, bring out food, and don't drop anything. Got it?" "Got it," Branson said, tying the apron around his waist. She sighed. "I don't have time to babysit you, so try not to mess up too much. I'm Amelia, by the way." "Branson," her eyes flickered with curiosity. "Branson, huh? Sounds fancy for someone applying for a job at a diner." Branson smiled slightly. "Trust me, I'm not as fancy as I look." Amelia didn't seem convinced, but she didn't press. "Come on, rich boy." Time to get to work. Branson had never worked so hard in his life. The lunch rush was chaos, with customers shouting orders and plates piling up. By the end of the day, his feet ached, his shirt was stained with coffee, and he had nearly dropped 3 trays. But as he wiped down a table, he caught Amelia watching him, a small smile playing on her lips. "Not bad," she admitted. Branson chuckled. "High praise," she shrugged. "Most new hires don't last a day." Branson leaned against the counter. "Then I guess I'll have to stick around." Amelia studied him for a long moment before nodding. "We'll see." Branson didn't know what it was, but something about Amelia made him want to stay. Maybe it was the way she moved through the diner like she belonged there, or the way she never hesitated to speak her mind. All he knew was that for the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about his wealth, his business, or proving Leo wrong. He was thinking about her. Branson wiped his brow as he stacked plates behind the counter, his muscles aching from a shift that felt like it would never end. The diner was a completely different world from the high-rise offices and boardrooms he was used to. There were no stock projections, no endless emails or corporate negotiations. Just the constant clatter of dishes, the hum of conversation, and the scent of sizzling bacon lingering in the air. Amelia breezed past him, balancing a tray on one hand while refilling a coffee cup with the other. She made it look effortless, even as exhaustion shadowed her sharp features. She barely spared him a glance before heading toward the next table, but Branson caught the flicker of approval in her eyes. By the time the last customer left, Branson's feet were screaming in protest. He leaned against the counter, watching as Amelia flipped chairs onto tables and scrubbed stray ketchup stains from the booths. "You survived another day," she said, not looking up. "Was there ever any doubt?" he asked, stretching his sore arms. She finally glanced at him, amusement flickering in her gaze. "Plenty." Branson chuckled, then reached for the rag she was using. She hesitated before handing it over, her fingers brushing against his for the briefest moment. He took over cleaning the last table, and for a while, they worked in silence. As he wiped down the counter, he noticed Amelia rolling her shoulders, wincing slightly. "Long day?" he asked. She shrugged. "They're all long." Something about the way she said it made Branson pause. He had seen the way she carried herself head high, shoulders squared, never letting exhaustion or frustration show. But now, in the quiet of the empty diner, she looked different, tired, weary. "How long have you worked here?" he asked. "Since I was 18. She wrung out a dishcloth in the sink. "I took over managing the place a couple of years ago." Branson glanced around. "It's yours." "Not exactly," she said, a hint of something unreadable in her voice. "Caleb owns it. He's family." "Kind of." Branson caught the hesitation in her voice but didn't press. He knew better than anyone that some stories weren't meant to be dragged into the light. Instead, he said, "You must really love this place." She let out a soft laugh. "Love is a strong word, but it's home." Branson thought about that. He had penthouses, vacation homes, and an estate in the countryside, but none of them had ever really felt like home. Not in the way Amelia talked about this tiny, worn-down diner. Before he could say anything, Caleb emerged from the back, tossing a towel onto the counter. "You did good today, kid." "Didn't break anything, which is more than I can say for half the people who come through here." Branson grinned. "High standards." Caleb gave a rough chuckle, then glanced at Amelia. "You locking up?" she nodded. "Yeah, I'll take care of it." Caleb grunted his approval and disappeared back into the kitchen. Branson tossed the rag into the sink. "Guess that's my cue to leave." Amelia crossed her arms, studying him. "You're not what I expected." He raised a brow. "What did you expect?" "Some rich boy who wouldn't last a day," she admitted. "But you haven't complained once, not even when that guy spilled an entire milkshake on you." Branson laughed, remembering the mess. "Maybe I just like a challenge." "Maybe," she said, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer than necessary. Then she turned toward the register, counting out the cash for the night. Branson watched her for a beat before heading for the door. The air outside was crisp, the streetlights humming softly in the quiet night. As he climbed the stairs to his tiny rented room, he realized something strange. He wasn't thinking about the bet. Not about proving Leo wrong, not about the money he had left behind. He was thinking about Amelia. Days blurred into a rhythm. Branson woke up before dawn, worked double shifts, and collapsed onto his mattress at night, exhausted but oddly satisfied. He was getting better at handling the chaos of the diner, learning the regulars' orders, and moving through the space like he belonged there. Amelia was a constant presence, sharp-witted and determined, moving faster than anyone else, always one step ahead. Branson found himself watching her more than he should, fascinated by the way she carried the weight of the place on her shoulders without ever faltering. One evening after closing, Amelia leaned against the counter, rubbing her temple. "Rough day?" Branson asked, sliding onto the stool next to her. She sighed. "One of the suppliers jacked up their prices again. If we don't find a new one soon, we'll have to raise menu prices, and that's not an option." Branson frowned. "What about negotiating?" She let out a dry laugh. "You don't negotiate with people who know you don't have another option." Branson considered that. In his world, deals were struck with power and leverage. But here, in the world Amelia operated in, there wasn't much room to negotiate when the odds were stacked against her. "You ever thought about expanding?" he asked. She shot him a look. "With what money?" Branson hesitated. He could have easily solved her problems with a single phone call, but that wasn't the point. This wasn't about him swooping in with his wealth. Still, the idea of Amelia struggling while he had spent his life throwing money at every inconvenience sat uneasily with him. "You ever thought about doing something else?" he asked carefully. She stiffened. "If this is about me being stuck here, save it. I'm not some charity case, Branson." "I didn't say you were," he said quickly. "I just meant." "Do you want this to be your life forever?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, she said, "I don't know." Branson didn't push. Instead, he reached for the coffee pot, pouring her a fresh cup. She stared at him, then shook her head with a small, tired smile. "You're a strange one, Branson. Good strange or bad strange." She took a sip of coffee, still deciding. Branson grinned, but underneath it, something in his chest tightened, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure what he wanted either. Branson had never been more exhausted in his life, but he had also never felt more alive. Each day at the diner stripped away another layer of the man he used to be, replacing boardroom negotiations with morning coffee rushes, power lunches with greasy burgers, and exclusive client meetings with a gruff nod from Caleb when he got an order right. But the real shift wasn't in his routine, it was in the way he looked at Amelia. She had become the center of his world without him realizing it. The way she moved through the diner, her presence commanding without effort, had captivated him from the start. But it was more than that now. It was how she carried the weight of every problem on her shoulders, how she never asked for help even when she needed it, how her laughter, rare but genuine, felt like a reward whenever he managed to pull it from her. One evening, long after the last customer had left, Amelia stood by the register, counting the day's earnings. Branson leaned against the counter, watching her, but she was too focused to notice. "You ever take a break?" he asked. She didn't look up. "Breaks don't pay the bills." Branson reached for a rag and started wiping down the counter, even though it was already clean. "You know, normal people take a night off, maybe go out, have fun." Amelia let out a short laugh. "Normal people don't have to keep a business running." He studied her, noting the faint shadows under her eyes, the tension in her jaw. "Come with me," he said suddenly. She frowned. "Where?" "Someplace that's not here." She hesitated. "I don't think, you don't have to think," he cut in. "Just say yes." Amelia looked at him for a long moment, then exhaled. "Fine. But if this is some rich boy attempt to take me to a 5-star restaurant, I'm walking home." Branson grinned. "Noted." They left the diner together, stepping into the cool night air. Branson led her down the street, past the familiar blocks she walked every day until they reached a small, tucked-away park. The place was quiet, lit only by the soft glow of street lamps. Amelia glanced around. "This is your big adventure," Branson shrugged. "Sometimes it's not about where you go, it's about who you're with." She gave him a skeptical look, but there was something softer in her expression. They sat on a bench, the hum of the city distant but ever present. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked after a while. Amelia crossed her arms. "Leaving where?" "This town, the diner, all of it." She was silent for a long moment. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but where would I go?" Anywhere, Branson said. You could do anything you wanted, she scoffed. That's easy for you to say, you don't have to worry about money. Branson didn't respond right away, she wasn't wrong. He had never truly felt trapped before, not like this. But for the first time, he wished he could take all the security he had and give it to her. Amelia turned to face him. Why does it matter to you? He met her gaze, the words forming before he could stop them. Because I care about you. She blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Branson, I know, he said quickly. You don't need saving, you don't want pity, I get it, but that's not what this is. She searched his face, trying to find the catch, the ulterior motive. When she didn't find one, she looked away. I don't know what to do with that, she admitted. Branson exhaled, leaning back against the bench. Then don't do anything, just let it be. They sat in silence, the night stretching between them. Branson didn't push, didn't try to convince her of anything. He had learned that Amelia didn't trust easily, and if he wanted to be someone she let in, he needed to earn it. Eventually, she stood. We should get back. Branson nodded, standing too. They walked together, the space between them filled with something unspoken but undeniably there. As they reached the diner, Amelia hesitated at the door. Thanks, she said quietly. For what? She gave him a look, one that said she wasn't going to spell it out. Then, without another word, she stepped inside, leaving Branson standing outside under the glow of the streetlight, his heart pounding in a way it never had before. Branson had never been a man who second-guessed himself, but when it came to Amelia, every moment felt like walking a tightrope between what he wanted and what she was willing to accept. The days slipped past faster than he expected, his time at the diner no longer feeling like part of a bet, but something real. He had learned the rhythm of the place, the way Amelia's expression softened when she was focused, the way she bit the inside of her cheek when counting the register, the way her laugh when he managed to pull one from her set something deep in his chest alight. But the month was almost up, and reality was about to crash down on them both. Branson had told himself he wouldn't interfere with Amelia's life. He had kept his promise, never offering money, never trying to change her world with the power of his own. But that didn't mean he hadn't been paying attention. Caleb had been acting distant the past few days, his usual gruff comments shorter, his eyes clouded with something Branson recognized as worry. He had seen Amelia brushing off conversations about the diner's finances, avoiding the topic whenever Caleb brought it up. Branson wasn't blind. He had spent years reading between the lines of high-stakes negotiations, he knew, when someone was on the verge of losing something they loved. So when he overheard Caleb on the phone in the back room, his voice tight with frustration, Branson knew exactly what was happening. The diner was in trouble. That night, Branson found Amelia sitting on the back steps behind the diner, her arms resting on her knees, eyes fixed on the pavement. She didn't look up when he sat beside her. "You're going to ask," she said. Branson didn't pretend not to know what she meant. "Why didn't you tell me?" she exhaled, shaking her head. "Because it's not your problem." "That's not how this works, Amelia. You don't get to carry everything alone." She let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "That's how I've always done it. It's how I know how to survive." Branson studied her, the tension in her shoulders, the way she wouldn't meet his gaze. He wanted to tell her that she didn't have to fight every battle alone, but he knew she wasn't ready to hear it. Instead, he said, "What if I had a way to help that doesn't involve me throwing money at the problem?" That got her attention. Her eyes flickered to his, wary but curious. "I'm listening." Branson leaned back against the steps. "The diner has regulars, right? People who have been coming here for years." Amelia nodded. "Then let's remind them why this place matters. Let's make a night they won't forget." She narrowed her eyes. "You're suggesting what exactly? A fundraiser?" "Not exactly, more like a celebration." A way to bring the community together, to remind them that this place isn't just another diner, it's home. She hesitated, chewing her lip. You think that would work? Branson shrugged. I think it's worth trying. Amelia was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, she nodded. Okay, but I'm not letting you take over, Branson grinned. Wouldn't dream of it. The night of the event, the diner was packed. The usual hum of conversation had transformed into something livelier, a steady buzz of laughter and music filling the space. Branson had spent the day helping Amelia and Caleb prepare, moving tables, hanging lights, making sure everything was perfect. He had never cared about a business deal as much as he cared about this night going right. Amelia moved through the crowd, her expression a mix of exhaustion and something close to hope. She had fought him on every detail, insisting that this wasn't a charity event, that it had to feel natural, like a thank you to the people who had supported the diner for years. And somehow, against all odds, it worked. People stayed longer than usual, ordering extra meals, slipping a little more cash into the tip jar. Conversations flowed, old regulars reminiscing about when they first started coming here, kids laughing as they shared milkshakes. Branson watched Amelia take it all in, her fingers gripping a dish towel like she was afraid to let herself believe it was real. When she finally looked at him, something unspoken passed between them. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. You did this. Branson shook his head. We did this. Amelia exhaled softly, and for the first time since he had met her, she looked like she wasn't carrying the weight of the world alone. Later that night, after the last customers had left and the diner was quiet once more, Amelia stood by the counter, turning a slip of paper between her fingers. Branson leaned against the booth across from her. What is it? She held it up. The night's total, it's more than we've made in months. Branson smiled. Then I'd say it was a success. Amelia set the paper down carefully, then turned to face him fully. Why did you do this? He didn't hesitate. Because I care about you. And because I don't want to leave without knowing you're going to be okay. Her expression flickered, something uncertain in her eyes. You're leaving? Branson exhaled. The bet's almost over. Amelia looked away, nodding slowly. Right, Branson stepped closer, but I don't want this to end. She met his gaze then, something raw in her expression. Then don't let it. He didn't think he just closed the distance between them. His hand cupped her face, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was slow, deep, and filled with every unspoken thing between them. She didn't pull away. When they finally broke apart, Amelia rested her forehead against his. I don't need saving, Branson. I know, he murmured. But that doesn't mean I'm not going to fight for you. She let out a quiet breath, and this time when she smiled, it was real. Then stay. Branson had never been more certain of anything in his life. He was done with bets. He was done with temporary. He was staying. Branson had never been the type to hesitate, but as he stood in the quiet of the diner, the weight of his decision settled over him. The month was nearly over. The life he had built here, temporary as it was supposed to be, had become something more. And Amelia had become everything. She was watching him, her expression carefully guarded, but he could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. He had promised to fight for her, to stay, yet doubt still lingered between them. The next morning, Branson woke before dawn, slipping out of his tiny rented room and heading downstairs. The diner was still dark, the silence unfamiliar. He had never seen it empty before. Pushing open the door, he stepped onto the street, inhaling the crisp morning air. The city was slowly waking, the distant hum of traffic growing. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a reminder of the world he had left behind. Leo. For a moment, Branson debated ignoring it, but he knew he couldn't avoid the inevitable. He answered, his voice even. Leo wasted no time. He was laughing, triumphant. I thought you'd be calling me by now, begging to get back to your penthouse. Instead, I had to track you down. Branson exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Guess I lasted longer than you expected. Yeah, and I'll admit I'm impressed, but you won, Branson. The bet's over. Time to come back to reality. Branson's grip tightened on the phone. The words should have brought relief, but instead they felt hollow. Leo continued. I'll have your accounts reinstated by the end of the day. You've got meetings lined up, clients waiting. Your world is ready for you to step back into it. Branson glanced at the diner behind him, the soft glow of the early morning sun casting long shadows. He had spent years chasing success, wealth, power, and yet none of it had ever made him feel the way Amelia did. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he wanted to go back. Leo's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Look, man, it was a fun experiment, but it's time to stop pretending. You don't belong there. Branson's jaw tightened. And if I do, a pause. Then a low chuckle. You're serious? Branson didn't answer. Leo sighed. You're really going to throw everything away for some woman? Branson's voice was firm. Her name is Amelia. And she's not just some woman. Come on, Leo scoffed. You barely know her. Branson shook his head. I know her better than I've known anyone in my life. Leo was silent for a long moment. Then finally he said, So what happens now? Branson didn't have an answer. He ended the call. Amelia had spent the morning avoiding the question she knew was coming. Branson had made a promise, but she had learned a long time ago that promises were easy to break. Reality always had a way of pulling people back where they belonged. So when she found him in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up as he helped Caleb prep for the day, she braced herself. Branson glanced up, meeting her gaze, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Amelia crossed her arms. You talked to him, didn't you? Branson nodded. Yeah, she inhaled slowly. And? He set down the knife he had been using, wiping his hands on a towel before stepping closer. And I told him I'm not ready to leave. Her heart stuttered. Not ready, Branson searched her face. I don't want to go back to my old life, Amelia, not if it means leaving you behind. She hated how much she wanted to believe him. Branson, your world isn't this. You can't just walk away from everything. Why not? His voice was steady. What's the point of having everything if it doesn't make me happy? She shook her head. You say that now, but what happens when the novelty wears off? When you miss the penthouses and the luxury? Branson reached for her hand, his touch warm, grounding. You think this is temporary for me? Amelia hesitated. Isn't it? His grip tightened slightly. It doesn't have to be. She wanted to believe him, but trust had never come easy. Branson exhaled, his voice softer now. Give me a reason to stay. Amelia swallowed hard. Do you need one? His gaze held hers, unwavering. No, but I want to hear it from you. She looked away, the words tangled in her throat. She had spent so long standing on her own, never relying on anyone. Letting him in meant risking everything. But as she stood there, his fingers laced with hers, she realized something terrifying. She didn't want him to walk away. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Stay. Branson stepped closer, his other hand cupping her face. Say it again. Her breath hitched. Stay. He kissed her then, and this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Just the undeniable truth between them. When they finally broke apart, Branson rested his forehead against hers. I'm not going anywhere. For the first time in her life, Amelia believed it. Branson never returned to his penthouse. The bet had been won, but the life he had built in those 30 days had become more than just a challenge. It had become home. He didn't buy the diner. Amelia would have fought him on that, but he did help in ways she would allow. Finding better suppliers, streamlining the costs, making sure the place would never face the kind of financial strain it had before. But more than that, he stayed. He stayed for the early mornings, the quiet moments before the rush. He stayed for the late nights, the stolen kisses behind the counter. He stayed for Amelia. And as he stood beside her, watching the diner fill with people, laughter, and warmth spilling through the space, He knew one thing for certain. He had spent his life chasing success. But love, real, undeniable, life-altering love, had found him when he least expected it, and he would never let it go. Branson had always thought happiness was something to be earned, something that came after success, after wealth, after proving himself. But standing in the diner, watching Amelia laugh as she wiped flour from her cheek, he realized happiness had nothing to do with any of that. It was in the quiet moments, the unexpected ones, the ones that didn't come with contracts or negotiations. The weeks had settled into an easy rhythm. Branson had become more than just another set of hands in the diner. He was part of it now. The regulars greeted him by name. Caleb no longer watched him like he expected him to bolt at any moment, and Amelia had let him in. But even as things felt solid between them, a part of Branson knew there was still something lingering beneath the surface, something Amelia hadn't said out loud yet. One evening, as the last of the customers filtered out and Caleb locked up, Branson found Amelia standing by the register, staring at a ledger with a crease between her brows. He leaned against the counter, waiting. She always had a way of keeping things to herself until she was ready to share. Finally, she sighed, closing the book with a soft thud. "We're stable," she admitted. "For now," Branson studied her. "But," her fingers traced the edge of the counter, "but I don't want to just survive. I want this place to thrive." He nodded slowly, sensing there was more. She hesitated before looking at him. "I've been thinking about expansion, not anything crazy, just another location. Something small but enough to grow." Branson felt a flicker of pride. He had seen how much she poured into this place, how deeply she cared. "You should do it." She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not," he admitted. "But neither was keeping this place afloat, and you did that." "If anyone can make it happen, it's you," she exhaled, something shifting in her expression. "I don't know where to start." Branson stepped closer. "Luckily, I do." She gave him a look, wary but intrigued. "I don't want handouts, Branson." "I'm not offering one," he said evenly. "I'm offering to help you build something." Together, she studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay." And just like that, they were moving forward. The following weeks were filled with plans, late-night discussions, and careful deliberations. Amelia was cautious, unwilling to take unnecessary risks, and Branson respected that. He didn't push, he guided, offering insight without taking control. They scouted potential locations together, examining spaces that could house a second diner. Amelia was meticulous, weighing every option, refusing to rush the decision. One afternoon, they stood outside a vacant cafe on the other side of town, the scent of fresh paint clinging to the air. Amelia crossed her arms, tilting her head as she took in the building. This might be it. Branson watched her, his chest tightening with something he couldn't quite name. "Then let's make it happen." She turned to him, something vulnerable behind her usual confidence. "Are you sure about this?" He reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I've never been more sure of anything." Her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to argue, but then she exhaled, squeezing his hand. "Okay." And just like that, it was theirs. The opening of the second location was a quiet success. Amelia refused anything flashy, wanting word of mouth to carry the business rather than grand gestures. Branson had never cared about a deal more in his life. He had spent years making decisions that impacted thousands, but none of them had ever felt as important as this, not because of the business itself, but because of what it meant for Amelia. As the first customers sat down, ordering meals from the familiar but refined menu, Amelia stood beside him, her hand brushing his. "We did it," she murmured. Branson glanced at her, his heart full. "No, you did." She turned to him then, something soft in her gaze. "Branson?" "Yeah." She didn't say anything, she just kissed him. It wasn't desperate or hurried. It was steady, certain, like a promise sealed in the way her fingers curled into his shirt, the way she melted into him, the way she let herself lean on him, just for a moment. When they pulled apart, she whispered, "You stayed." Branson smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I wasn't going anywhere," she exhaled, resting her forehead against his. Good. And for the first time in his life, Branson wasn't chasing something just out of reach. He had everything he needed, right here.